Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for this morning's discussion. My name is Will Ewing, and I'm delighted to be chairing today's discussion. It is, of course, a very timely one. At some point, we are going to emerge from this crisis, and if we are going to do so successfully, schools are going to play an absolutely essential role in that emergence. I think if there's one thing we've really learnt from the last year, it is just how central the school is to the life of the nation. Without them, with them shut, it seems like things just fall apart. And I'm glad that it's a theme that's clearly struck a chord with you all. We've only been advertising this event for a couple of weeks, and we've got almost 250 registrations. So let me extend a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for giving up your time, and a very warm welcome and thanks to our panel as well. We're very lucky to be joined by five leading thinkers in the nexus between post-liberal politics and schooling. Two of them have spent their careers in the classroom. The others have spent their careers thinking about these issues in the lecture room. I'm going to introduce them quickly now so that I don't break up the rhythm of the event later on, and I'm then going to pass to Philip to say some introductory opening remarks to set the conversation in context. Our first speaker after Philip will be Professor John Milbank. He is Emeritus Professor at the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Nottingham, and one of this nation's leading philosophers, as well as a particular thinker on post-liberalism. Then we have Catherine Birbalsingh, CBE, founder and headmistress of Michaela Community School at Wembley. And she, in my opinion, has shown us a path, both in her work and in her writings that accompany her work, for what the post-liberal school might look like. She's going to talk to us about that. Our third speaker is Michael Merrick, who is executive head of the St. Ninian Catholic Federation in Cumbria. Michael's contributed to both the Blue Labour and Red Tory political movements, and he came to some prominence on Radio 4 a few years ago when he called into question what he called the creed of social mobility, something I'm sure he's going to touch on today. And our last speaker is Dr. Dominic Burbidge, lecturer in politics at St. Peter's College at the University of Oxford, whose research focuses on social trust and the centrality of truth in education. And he's the founder and the director of the Canterbury Institute, who explore and furthering some of these questions today. Just for those of you who haven't attended a Res Publica webinar before, just a few very quick ground rules before we kick off. Just to give you a sense about how things are going to run, after Philip speaks, I'm going to go to each of the four panelists in turn, who will speak for about 5 minutes on this question. After they've spoken, I'm going to go back to them for some further remarks, and then I'm going to open up to the floor to give you all a chance to pitch in. Please keep your questions coming right from the word go. If you could use the Q&A function rather than the chat function, that would be great. And a bit of a Res Publica feature is that we tend to come to you for audio and video when you ask a question. So please be warned, and please have your webcams sort of at the ready for that moment. I think that's it. Please also be aware that the event is live and being recorded. And if you'd like to tweet as we're going along, the hashtag is postliberalschool. So Philip, over to you to give us an introduction.
Thank you very much, Will, and hello to everybody online and indeed watching it in a recording. This is another one of Res Publica's post-liberal seminars. And what we try to do is essentially challenge the liberal hegemony from the realm of metaphysics right down to policy and practice. And we've been doing that for some time now. And we've held a number of events where we discuss how we might approach an entirely new policy agenda to tackle some of the consequences of being governed by the extreme versions of liberalism that have governed us. Now, when we say post-liberal, we don't mean we're illiberal authoritarian, or dreadful. We just mean that liberty precedes liberalism, and liberty doesn't have its foundation in the quest for self-interest or the quest for unconstrained human freedom. But true liberty has its foundation in mutual obligations, shared care, and collective trust and affirmation, and dare I say it, belief in universals that can forward us as a nation and indeed as a human international community. And one of the reasons why we in Res Publica oppose liberalism is that it doesn't deliver on what it promises. It doesn't deliver economic security. It sits at one and at peace with rampant inequality that makes class the biggest penalty, but never addresses class, and instead prefers the woke agenda of focusing on identity politics, which only serves as a proxy for further advancing the middle class commissar class who enforce this agenda, and increases, of course, the ongoing penalty of those whose needs remained unaddressed, which of course is more often than not the vagaries, which aren't particularly vague, but are often penal, of class and place. But we don't just oppose liberalism economically because it fails to secure people and give them the decent chance of a prosperous and secure life. We also oppose liberalism culturally because it takes apart the mutual obligations that have made this country great, that Captain Tom, for instance, exemplified, that allowed us as a culture to support one another, advance us all, and indeed advance this agenda across the world. So that liberalism culturally, again, just advances the well-positioned and the adroit and the already powerful. Because at base and philosophically, all liberalism believes in is itself, which is an empty, nihilistic pursuit of self-advancement and freedom. And it's prepared to sacrifice literally anything else in order to increase freedom. And if you have a society that's just founded on freedom, not on obligation, not on care, you just have a society for the already powerful. And that runs counter to everything liberalism claims, but that's everything liberalism has delivered. So what we try to do at Res Publica is analyze the costs of liberalism in each different policy area. It can be pensions, can be welfare, and today it's schooling. So I'm very grateful to the panelists for doing this. So I thank you for signing in, and we all look forward to learning from the wonderful people that Will has brought together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. Professor Milbank, would you like to kick us off to think about how post-liberalism intersects with schooling?
Yes, certainly. What's then the main difference between a liberal approach to education and a post-liberal approach to education? I think you could sum it up by saying that for liberalism, education is instrumentally subordinated to politics and economics and social processes. Either that, or it's vaguely for the individual and for the individual developing whatever the individual happens to want. So there's this cleavage, if you like, between public role regarded in a very functional way and an outright individualism, simply proclaiming choice and respect for choice and so forth. Now, I think that a post-liberal approach to education, the main thing to say about it is that it doesn't subordinate education to politics. Instead, it thinks of politics itself as being about education and formation. In other words, it thinks of politics as being about trying to produce virtuous citizens, and these virtuous citizens in turn try to produce a virtuous society, instead of the idea that politics is simply a contract between isolated individuals vaguely tolerating each other. And I think the most important practical consequence of this sense that politics and education are linked, and that politics is about the formation of the individual, is that it doesn't separate education from ethics. And I think that the most striking feature of modern education is that ethics, if it's treated at all, is put into a compartment, whereas traditionally knowledge was thought to be dangerous unless it's linked to morality. And so ethical training should be surely infusing everything that we're doing educationally, and we shouldn't have this separation between individual fulfillment and political function. The roles we play in public should be intrinsically fulfilling as well as contributing to the well-being of society. Now, I think the consequence of the liberal approach you can see in the current reality. And very briefly, let me draw attention to three things. First of all, as a lot of people have said, recent political divides tend to be between the educated and the uneducated, or the less educated. And this is a very striking new feature, that we've got a bad mode of meritocracy in which the uneducated feel excluded. And secondly, throughout education, especially in universities, but also in schools, we have a mental health crisis. It seems that education is making students actually ill. And thirdly, we have at the moment the worst of all possible worlds. We don't have communication of very high academic standards, but we don't have encouragement of creativity either. We have a form of rote learning that communicates a very sort of thin level of the academic that seems to entitle people without very great skills to get into more privileged jobs. So what would be the answer in post-liberal terms to those three problems? Well, I think first of all, we need far more stress on the vocational, far more sense that some people are suited to the very academic, but not everybody. And we need far more respect for vocational skills, and a sense that they too are linked to genuine knowledge. And I think the more we have the vocational, the more we can combine a sense of the purpose, the personally fulfilling, with a social role, and ends this sort of cleavage between mere individual predilection on the one hand, and the learning of rather mechanical utilitarian skills on the other hand. Secondly, in relation to this mental health crisis, I think that what education fails to deliver is any kind of all-round vision of reality, that people need to make sense of reality. It's a human need. And although, we disagree about that, ignoring that area because we disagree is hopeless and has very damaging psychological consequences. So we need a far more holistic approach. We need children to be able to join up what they're learning in different areas, particularly in the arts and the sciences. And that's important for everybody, whether you're going into something more vocational or academic. You still need that sense of some sort of overall vision. What is human life actually all about? And then I think the third thing is that we need to somehow get rid of this idea of a shallow meritocracy, and end the division between you know, the functional and the public on the one hand, and the private and choice by the other, on the other, about having a much stronger sense of the communication of our shared traditions, that young children need to be introduced to founding myths, including the stories of the Bible. We need to know where we are coming from as a culture. And we need to have far more the sense that it's by being inducted into a tradition that you are then able to make your own creative contribution. So again, ending this sense of a divide between the merely public and cultural and functional on the one hand, and the supposedly kind of natural and individualistic and spontaneous on the other hand. This is a denial of our real human situation. In reality, we're always imbibing the past and the richness of the past and the aims towards truth and goodness and beauty in particular traditions. And then we can make our own contribution within that tradition. Again, combining a sense of personal fulfillment with one of public contribution. So that's all I've got to say.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much for setting out that philosophical framework for what it might look like in theory. Maybe going over to Catherine to think about what some of these questions look like within the daily practice of a school. I'd love to hear, Catherine, about the power of culture and all that you've achieved at Michaela in 5 minutes.
Yeah, sure. Well, it was interesting. I hope it's all right if I call you John.
Of course, yeah. It's what I'm called.
Yes. Interesting. Listen, I'm not sure I agree with some of what you say. I think that it's that the divide isn't between whether or not children should be brought up with this idea of a public role, or we're seeing it as an individualist one. And I don't think that the people, for instance, who oppose what we do at Michaela are opposed to ethical training. I think they very much embrace the idea of ethical training. It's just that they believe that being an ethical person is to be something very different to what we think it is to be an ethical person.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. So we need to ask what the purpose is of school. And we believe very much that it's about ensuring that the children are able to lead dignified lives. And to be able to live a dignified life, I always talk about a bag of goodies that schools should provide children with. And in that bag that they fill up during their school days, it should include lots of knowledge and skills, so that they can go about and live a fulfilled life. They can find some kind of career that they can do and enjoy. They can have knowledge about the world, which will help them interpret things and understand the world around them, so that they don't go through life in a kind of blur, not really just not understanding what's about them. And they should also have a sense of, and this is where I would say that the kind of where I do agree, this idea of a public role, a sense of duty to their community, to their families, to other people, and feel as if they're living for something, that they're living a dignified life. Now, that's what we would say. I would say people who don't like what we do would say that they believe very much in the idea of ethical training, but that to be an ethical person, you must reject the establishment and the status quo. And that in order to do that, you must be a revolutionary. So that school exists in order to create revolutionaries, as opposed to creating people who feel like they belong, right? So the idea of having a public role and a duty and to other people is to be exactly the opposite to the woke agenda. The more traditionalist agenda is trying to make, so we sing God Save the Queen, and we sing I vow to thee my country, and we have a flag outside, and the whole idea is to ensure that the children feel as if they belong to their country. Our detractors, on the other hand, dislike that because they think school is about trying to create these revolutionaries who will reject all that is country and all that is conformist. You know, they don't want our children to be dentists. They want them to be radical academics, you know, writing, you know, against the establishment. Now, what I think they fail to realize is that the best sort of radical academics have traditional educations. You know, it's impossible to be a successful radical unless you have rejected something that you know lots about. And if you don't know much about Shakespeare and about your country's history and geography and so on, it's impossible to reject that in a intellectual manner, in a practical manner, in any kind of manner, because you don't actually understand it. So when I say about that bag of goodies, it's our role to fill up that bag of goodies. And they then go off and understand the world around them and live a dignified life. They might then choose to become radicals. They might choose to become dentists. It doesn't really matter. I don't kind of care. That's not my role to choose their careers or to choose their lives. Some of them might decide to put on a backpack and roam the world on their own for 20 years. Others might decide to get married and have children. You know, it's up to them. I just need to have exposed them to the knowledge and skills and culture. And this is our book called The Power of Culture, which you just, you know, you were referring to, Will, what we've done here, which is to create a culture where they feel very much that they belong to their school, that they belong to their country, and that they have a duty to give something back. And they will choose to do that in different ways. The dentist gives something back by looking after people's teeth, and the radical does that by feeling that they are overthrowing the establishment, and that's what they believe is the right way to be. And our children, if you were to come into our school and talk to them, you will find some of them are pro-Brexit and some of them are very much Remainers, and some of them would rather die than vote Conservative, and others are you know, real conservatives. We even have a few children who at the time when we did our mock election wanted to vote UKIP, and we're in the inner city, you know, which is really quite shocking. You think, well, how is that possible? And I certainly don't talk to them about UKIP ever. I mean, but when we did the mock exam, a few of them voted for UKIP. So, you know, and why is that? Why is it that they're so different in their thinking and in their understanding of the world? Because what we've done is we've given them lots of knowledge, and then they have been able to make up their own minds about what they think. And that is what school should be about. But if, on the other hand, the people who are educating children have a particular agenda to make them into these revolutionaries, then it's very difficult for the child to think outside of that box. And I don't think that's our role as teachers. Our role as the teachers is to provide them with all the options, but to also ensure that they're able to lead dignified lives. That is key. And I think too often the middle classes think that they don't understand what dignity is. They sometimes think that dignity is all about being rich, or it's just, they don't understand that it's about having a set of values and understanding that you belong to your country and that you have a certain duty to your country and to the people around you. You know, Philip talked about obligation and care. These are things, these are ideas that need to be instilled in children, because otherwise, as John was saying, they just run off and become individualists, and they forget about their public role. So that's why John was referring to that. And I was saying, well, I disagree with it. I mean, it's right that there's the public and individualist pull, that tension, but actually it's more complex than just saying it like that. So yes, that's what I'd say.
Thank you, Catherine. That's great. And I'd be interested, Michael, whether the picture looks the same in Northwest London as it does up in the north in Cumbria.
Thank you, Will. I mean, in the first instance, rarely. I mean, our internet connections are not as good for starters, so the pictures are usually of a lesser quality. So yeah,
behind the red wall again.
So yeah, I know I've started already, first 20 seconds. So yeah, invited along to speak about social mobility and what post-liberal schooling would look like. And some of this does kind of grow from what's already been mentioned in the room. I would say that the question, is social mobility the most important tell us for our education system, is the most think tankiest of think tank questions, I've got to say. But nonetheless, still very important, because ultimately it's become almost the foundational creed of our society at the moment. Alongside meritocracy, which, let's be honest, is just kind of a form of Pelagianism, really. This is kind of our version of the American dream. And what it does is it provides a fig leaf for social injustice, and it actually, I would argue, provides an internal mechanism for justifying people who don't go on to lead those dignified lives, because there's already a ready-made explanation of that, which is their lack of effort or their lack of will to ensure this outcome. Now, obviously, social mobility, as it's been presented as a political idea, has become associated with a kind of culture class. I mean, it's almost inevitable, because it's nearly always framed as kind of rising beyond and leaving behind, and you know, kind of not being part of that anymore. And important to stress that that's both physical and in terms of values and beliefs. Social mobility in this country nearly always means moving away. It means leaving behind, like in a very physical, obvious way, leaving those people, those places behind us. And with that comes obviously dislocation of relationships, but also the other side of it is those values and beliefs too, that in some sense to have progressed in life is to have left behind that way of seeing the world too. The way I've phrased it previously, you know, pithily really, but nonetheless I think true, is that social mobility is kind of about not being like your mum or dad. And I think that's a great tragedy, really, that we've made that as a core kind of component of our understanding of success and the good life. Now, it's important to stress that this notion of being left behind is inherently disparaging. We can't really get around it. But the key thing for me, the key thing that worries me really, is that it's not able to account for those who's left behind, those who are left behind. Its sole interest, its sole focus is this narrative of self-empowerment, of self-realization, of going on and taking from the world that which you are owed, or that which, more importantly, you have earned. And it doesn't concern itself with those who have not taken that path. And it kind of, I think one way I think that this could be illustrated is if anybody ever seen the film Educating Rita, and is that scene, isn't there, where they're in the club and the mother starts crying, and she says, you know, what's wrong, Mum? And the mother replies, well, surely there are better songs than this. And Rita reflects, oh, that's all I'm doing, isn't it? I'm just going to sing a better song. But I suppose, think that we need to also answer the question, well, what about the 40 others who are quite happy with that song? Where is their space in our understanding of the good life, our understanding of, you know, having the ability to lead a dignified life? And how does our schooling help them do that? Now, I think that one way to demonstrate this kind of inherent disparaging nature of social mobility is the fact that it's always one way. Nobody talks about social mobility in a downward direction. I mean, that would be seen as terrible, wouldn't it? And also, it's important to know it's always aimed at the working class. I mean, for middle class, it's not really social mobility, it's social stasis that people want. It's being able to maintain your position. What this is really about most of the time is getting working class kids to no longer be working class kids, to leave those places behind. And for that reason, it provokes. And, you know, I'm not saying that this is done for any sort of malign intent or anything, but there's certainly an unintended consequence there about how it casts those who choose not to take that pathway. Now, the other side of schools kind of buying into this and thinking, well, this is our job. Our job is to give children all of these various options that they can choose. But really, it's about how many go to university. It's about what grades they get. It's about credentialism. That becomes kind of a fig leaf for us having a system that's effectively created a grad class protectionism, that actually those people who historically could have accessed positions of status and dignity within society, but through employment, have been locked out. They've been locked out, and they would have historically been able to access those things. Whereas now we've got this credentialism that means that we've got a grad class capture that stops that equitable division of opportunity and resource and status and dignity in society. And that's a big problem. But I probably zoom out a little bit and put that into a regional kind of focus too, because if social mobility is about moving away, then that usually means two things. Number one, to go and get the education, to go and get the credentials. And secondly, to then access the employment markets that those credentials are their currency for. And so what this means is that you develop a really significant regional inequality where swathes of the country effectively become feeder regions for those places where social mobility can be realized, which largely, mostly speaking, is the big cities. And so in places like mine, in Cumbria, in the southwest, in Lincolnshire, in Northumberland, this does have an impact because the grad class opportunities are further away, but that doesn't mean to say that the jobs that have been protected as grad class are no longer necessary in those locales, or are no longer desirable by those who are left behind, or no longer desired by those who are left behind. Now, with all of those things, and I know I've just thrown a lot of stuff in there shotgun, and each of them could be a big longer topic, and do forgive me for that, but I would probably, put in two moderating comments to that. And the first one is this: as much as I can sit here and mourn about how social mobility, the impact social mobility has on social cohesion, on harmony, on our understanding of the good life, nonetheless, we do have a full state education system funded by the taxpayer, and so it's not illegitimate for the government of the day to decide that investment has to have some sort of specific outcome, and that outcome will have some sort of relationship with the market and with the economy. We could disagree with that. We could determine for ourselves quite what that relation should be, but it's not unreasonable, if the state is providing that education, that they should have a view on that too. And obviously, when that's the case, when the state is the main provider and the dominant provider, then obviously the cultural view kind of grown in those places will tend to reflect that too. And this can be done through policy and through procedure, but also through all sorts of more organic things, like the teachers that you bring in, the training that they've received, and the way this thing kind of spreads out over the decades. And lastly, the other thing I would add, and this is a complicating factor for my argument, I won't hide away from it, because it is true, is that nonetheless there is quite often a family instinct to want better for our own children, at least in the abstract. We want them to go on and do better than we've done. We want them to go on and not have to live with some of the things that we've had to live with in our lives. And so, in reality, we can't just dismiss the idea. We can't just cast social mobility as the bad guy here. I suppose the debate is, what's its proper place, and how do we make sure we take care of those who have kind of lost out from that way of looking at the world? And I would say it even includes those families who want better for their children, because it's not until decades later when, well, I think of my own family, when people have been toward the end of their life and their families are scattered across the country, and it leads to loneliness because there's nobody there with them anymore. Now, the second part of the question was about a vision for a post-liberal school, and I'm very aware that I'm ticking up against that clock, so I'll try and go quick for you, Will. And so I'll just throw in three things really that might be kind of focused for later discussion. The first, I would say the purpose of schooling is not preparation. For me, it's not preparation for the markets. It's not even straightforwardly about character development. I would probably phrase it that it's more like induction. It's induction into a culture, into a place. It's induction into a tradition. It's induction into a role and function in society, into the story of us. And obviously that includes the knowledge and the skills. It includes knowledge of our history and who we are. It includes our ability to contribute, and it includes an assessment of what the good life is and why we should aim for it. So I would say that that's the purpose of schooling. Secondly, I would hope a post-liberal education, I probably shouldn't say this as someone who's in education, might actually reconfigure its understanding of the rightful place of education. I think we've deified it. We've tethered it to social mobility and life chances. And by doing that, it's become destructive of its own goals. We now make, and John, you touched on this, we now make not only professional judgment based on credentialism, based on education and the credentials it leads to, but also moral judgment about people. And for those people who don't have that, we've created like a subclass of people where we not only justify them not having it, but we don't think it's our responsibility to give them an opportunity to live that life neither. And so I think that's been a downside of the way that we've put education so front and center, and then made it the chief currency by which we might access future success. And finally, I would say a third point that I hope post-liberal people might think about is some real curriculum diversity. Yes, there's absolutely a clear space for the academic curriculum. You would need it. if you were going to have an idea of induction. But it's become an increasingly narrow curriculum, narrow to those academic pursuits. I think T.S. Eliot called it the languages of human learning, but there has to be more than just that. And so I think, yes, I know that quite often this is comes under the banner of vocational education, but I would say yes, definitely include more of that. But I would personally stay away from the idea that there's a non-academic route and an academic route, and you divide the kids into one or the other. I think actually real curriculum diversity will give all of that to everybody.
Thank you, Michael. Excellent contribution. Dominic, over to you.
Thanks very much. Really interesting discussion. I'm fascinated by all. I've got tons of questions. I know lots of people watching have questions as well, so I'm really keen to get to discussion. The my approach is to sort of look at what is the flourishing individual, what is the flourishing society in the 21st century, what does it look like, and then work back from that into what kind of schooling as well as university process would arrive at that. And it's quite clear that I think we would all sort of have common agreement that part of being a flourishing person is to feel needed, and in that way providing, supporting, obligated towards helping other people, and through that finding rich meaning and purpose to your life. At the same time, you need the virtues to be able to arrive at the fulfillment of those obligations, or you'll end in frustration. This could be in the form of exhaustion. You see in some NGO, charitable sector workers, they have very clear sense of purpose, but they can get exhausted in that process. Or you see it in terms of those who feel that they don't have the sorts of skills to really help others. Maybe it's, you know, I'm not skilled enough to help my children in their schooling, or I'm not skilled enough to be a good nurse. And in fact, that's where I would have found meaning. So we need to work back from that. And from that point of view, I always feel that understanding things in virtue terms is very helpful. John has sort of brought that up. And by that, we mean the sort of personal capacities to realize your goals. They're the sort of good habits that allow you to go through many different tasks, but carrying over the depths of goodness and habits that allow you to be successful. And so from that point of view, there's nothing about credentialing in that process. A post-liberal education is looking at what the flourishing individual and society is going to look like, and what virtues are going to lead you towards those goals. And so in this sense, we have to recognize overall that the economy does lead to specialization. And this is a big struggle with the notion of virtue, because virtue should be the sorts of good habits and skills that you have in a very transferable manner. At the same time, the economy is demanding quite a high degree of specialization. And so this tension is something that the educational institutions are only going to increasingly have to deal with. And of course, social mobility questions politicize that and talk about how differences of background can prevent access to the most specialized professions. But apart from that question of social mobility, there's also the question of authenticity of your life with respect to a particular purpose or vocation. So I set up the Canterbury Institute, which is about having academics reorganized towards the discovery of truth as their vocation. In this sense, I am very interested in all of what Michael said. And one of the ways of dealing with this this unfortunate framing between the academic pursuits being somewhat sort of intellectual and then more manual practical things being more vocational is to instead say that actually the academic is vocational as well. So academics are not really there to make money. Intellectual pursuit shouldn't really be about money. Of course, you need, you know, the basics. but from the point of view of it is a disciplining of oneself towards the pursuit of something very practical, which in this sense is truth, giving people, truth, their purpose, reality, self-discovery, in this sense, arriving at the sort of authenticity of the individual. So for the Canterbury Institute, we have these kind of academic retreats where you go for like 3-4 days without any device that can connect to the internet. And in this sense, we realize that lots of people are good at covering the news and consuming current affairs, but that's not the particular role of the academic. So you do specialize, but at the same time, you grow those virtues. But moving back from what a flourishing individual looks like, what a flourishing society looks like, is quite clear to me that there are 3 big challenges on the horizon. One is the ability to communicate the value of what you do to other people in a context of hyper specialization. And this is part of the reason why there can be so much anger at some people earning more money than others without having a sense of what it is that people are doing. In what way can we judge whether they are serving or not? And of course, some government level, political level judgment has to be made as to what we fund, what we don't fund. And part of that has got to be an understanding of to what extent one is serving others. The second is social trust, that it does seem that trust is breaking down, and using education to focus on social mobility hasn't healed questions of trust. It's in fact created lots of feelings of distrust between what's understood as sort of winners and losers. But the third challenge here is this authenticity of how your work corresponds to your life goals. And in this sense, I agree with everything has been said by Catherine in terms of getting a clear culture and a sense of belonging, and also what John mentioned in terms of having a narrative for one's life. In this sense, the 21st century has to have ever greater freedoms for schools that have particular values. And it could be religious values, or it could be that they're centered around a collection of virtues or understandings of purpose and belonging. But unless you have that, you don't bring that set of values to the relational level between teacher and student. And in that sense, this is the only route to help ground people with authentic examples of living out your purpose in service to others. Young people have this big kind of fear of missing out, which is in part produced through social media, which is that we're in a hyper-comparative environment. And I don't think anyone, in terms of us on the panel, has really experienced the sort of emotional tensions that come through a permanence of comparison with others. And the fear of missing out does affect education and training, because you can't have the energy to invest in something unless you're sure you're going to be brilliant at it. But if you don't take that gamble, you'll never have the time and energy to develop the virtues of that, end goal, flourishing person and flourishing society. So you have all of these young people that are basically caught in this middle space of always feeling they're worse than other people, but never having the guidance to be able to realize their more long-term goals. So education has got to help with that. And that means values. It means relational knowledge about the virtues of navigating and creating a sense of trust and solidarity with those around you.
Thank you, Dominic. Okay, we've got lots of great questions coming in, but I'm just going to go to each of our panelists for a very quick question, so just 2 minutes or so, picking up some of the things that have been discussed. But for those of you who've asked questions, I'll be signaling that I'm going to come live to you, and Mike will bring the microphone to you in a short while. Okay, so starting with John. John, I know in some of your other writings on the topic that you have made comments about elites and the nihilism of the elite. How do we remoralize the elite, as you say it, and how do we bring back concepts of prestige and honor to the elite class that I think I'm right in saying that you think has been lost in the last 30 or 40 years?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, because, you know, I broadly agree with the kind of critique that people like Michael Sandel are making of meritocracy. But I think that maybe what's missing from that critique is the idea that we do need a more genuine elite. In other words, I think that what we've got at the moment is an incredibly irresponsible, an incredibly selfish elite. And while part of the answer to that is certainly we need a much more democratic education, you know, a less competitive education, an education more directed towards realizing what each individual is capable of. Nonetheless, it's impossible to have a society in which there aren't, you know, at every level of society, you know, people of more ability, people who are relatively setting the agenda. And I think if you only have a kind of negative attitude towards that, if you like what Catherine is talking about as a revolutionary attitude, that's never going to work. You know, when the revolutionaries get into charge themselves, they become also a bad elite. So that I think we have to be honest and admit the need for trying to produce, again, at every level in society, people who are in kind of more architectonic positions, having a much greater sense of honor and responsibility. And you know, it's what Coleridge talked about as a clerisy, and in a sense, it is a new kind of aristocracy, you know, even if it's very open to social mobility. And how do you do that? It's very, very difficult. But I think part of the answer is you only get respect if you do exercise a sense of honor. So this isn't just idealism. The problem is at the moment that we award respect to simply people who are very wealthy or to celebrities and so on. We've somehow got to shape a culture that removes that kind of respect, so that, yeah, we do respect people like Captain Tom instead. And then because people aim not really essentially for money and power only, they aim for recognition and prestige. We've got to somehow reattach prestige to, you know, honor and virtue and responsibility. And that, of course, means crafting a different kind of economy in which you can't have positions of control without exercising social responsibility. So that, you know, while I agree with Catherine, you know, that I'm against schools trying to produce revolutionaries, I'm also against them trying to produce capitalists. That my critique is aimed at the liberalism on either side.
Thanks, John. One concern I have listening to you all is that any teacher or head or member from the DFE who's listening along would be nodding absolutely in agreement. So I'm quite keen to hear from Catherine about, just in the practice of running a school and her career as a teacher, what about this critique is different? And I think when I've read Catherine's work, particularly what Michaela seems to do is to bound the choice quite heavily. So on questions like whether students are allowed a mobile phone or not, what they should talk about at lunch, what they should be memorizing, that sort of thing. So I'd love to hear from Catherine sort of, yes, what it is about her vision and her culture which departs from, I suppose, the mainstream as it is at the moment.
Yeah, well, I think if you begin with the idea that school is meant to create little revolutionaries, then you naturally reject the idea of having, let's say, strict behavior systems. So our behavior systems are, you know, we have very high expectations, meaning that the children will walk in silence and in single file in the corridors to their lessons. And there are lots of people listening who think, gosh, why do you go to those extremes? Why do you do that? Because in the inner city, if you don't do that, the result will be children hitting each other, fights breaking out, running and screaming, doors slamming, and so on. Now, and actually, I would argue that this happens in more than just in schools in the inner city. In any case, now it may be that some people think, well, that's better, and there are people who think that. They think that because they would prefer the kind of natural kind of chaos, because they think that that chaos encourages children to think for themselves, and that the oppression of silence somehow stifles thought. I would say quite the opposite. When you have silence, you're able to think. When you have silence in a classroom, you're able to hear the teacher. When you have order and structure in a school, the children aren't terrified to put their hands up in the lesson. So too often there is a culture, I would say, in schools, not just in the inner city, but all over the place, where children don't want to put their hands up because they don't want to be seen as the nerd or the meek or whatever the trendy word is to describe these kids. And you'll all have seen many Hollywood films where that's exactly the case. Children in the school, you don't want to be the kid who everyone dislikes because the teacher likes you and your teacher's pet and so on. That doesn't exist in culture in our school at all. And that's because everybody wants to be able to participate in the lesson. And that's because we've got order and structure. If you, however, hand over the kind of the strings to the children, then the children will go down the natural route of the more popular kids will be the prettier kids, the richer kids, the louder kids, the ones who get involved in various undesirables outside of schools. So boys who get involved with gangs or who steal and that sort of thing will become very popular with the girls and with everyone, actually. And and if you allow that, if you allow them to be pulling the strings, as it were, then you have that kind of chaos. On the other hand, if the headmistress is pulling the strings, then you don't get that. And it's interesting. I once sat at lunch with the children where one of our year sevens said to me, you're the headmistress, aren't you, miss? And I said, yes. And he said, oh, it doesn't feel like you're the headmistress. And I said, oh, is that because I'm not in the yard kind of organizing everybody and giving orders and saying where people need to go? And and I often think that that's what people imagine. Our detractors outside think that I'm some kind of, they think that I imagine marching through the halls with a whip and punishing children and so on. They call me the strictest headmistress in Britain. In any case, and in actual fact, the children are not seeing me like that. He said, well, we don't really see you out there. And I said, no. And I said, yes, I can see why you think I'm not the headmistress, but trust me, I am. And that really is, that's it. I'm not marching around the halls and I'm not getting a kick out of putting children in detention, but I am in control of the school. And I think too often that isn't necessarily the case. And we have this idea of everyone, that we're handing it over to the kids, and that's wrong. Our children think outside the box and disagree with each other and have their own opinions and think independently and are creative, precisely because we have an ordered and structured environment. That's where creativity comes from, the order and the structure. And sadly, we misunderstand the kind of the fertile ground that's required to inspire creativity and structure. So what you were referring to there, Will, is, at lunch, we have a topic of conversation for the children, and they have a very organized lunch. So it's what we call family lunch, because many of our children won't necessarily have dinner at home around a table. And so we create that atmosphere at lunch where one of them goes with a role of picking up the food, and then somebody serves it, and they all eat from the same pot of food, and they all eat the same food. And just like you would do at the dinner table at home. And then we give them a topic of conversation. And the idea there is to teach them how to hold the knife and fork while at the same time being able to eat your food. These are skills. When I talked about the goodie bag of skills, I'm not just talking about knowing Shakespeare and Dickens. I'm saying being able to sit straight on a chair. We're all sat on our chairs. We take it for granted. I'm telling you, there are many children in our country who cannot sit on a chair. They're unable to bring a pen to school. They're unable to turn up on time. They're unable to have a conversation with someone while eating their food. I know that when our children first come here, they can't do it. We have to teach them how to do it. And so these are all skills that go in that goodie bag, which will enable them to live dignified lives. Because if you're unable to sit on a chair and turn up on time and count your change in a shop, and if you are functionally illiterate and you spend your whole life pretending to people that you can read when you really can't, you are simply unable to live a dignified life. Now, I mean, where I would push back a little bit on what Michael was saying, although obviously I agree generally with what he was saying, was that, I mean, and yes, he's right on the whole kind of push in schools can often be far too much about, you know, you're doing this so that you can drive a nice car and you're doing this so that you can earn loads of money. And we would certainly never say that at Michaela, but we do want all our children to fulfill their potential. And fulfilling their potential at school is about being able to read better and write better and be more numerate. And I won't apologize for that. I think it's good that our children are as numerate as they can possibly be.
Michael,
you know?
would agree.
Well, let's go on to Michael then, because I think that's a really interesting jumping off point to think about where some of what we've talked about in the past in the past hour intersects with the question of rigor, I suppose. Because I suppose when you hear a word like relationality and the importance of a community, sometimes in the execution that might go towards something like group work, which in large respect seems to have been debunked by educationalists. And again, with vocational education, the Gove reforms looked directly at the amount of schools that were pushing children towards softer vocational qualifications that could have achieved their potential more, as Catherine was saying. So it'd be great to hear, Michael, just about, again, in very practical details, the sort of the intersection between curriculum and rigor, but whilst also how that interplays with the dignified life and values and relationality.
I mean, I wish I could say something that could add spice to that, but I mean, it just strikes me as a statement of the obvious, yeah, that rigor's a good thing. So there's no argument here. I suppose what the point I would make is possibly twofold. Firstly, when it comes to dignity and being able to live a dignified life, I'd probably argue that the problem's further upstream than the schools. That schools are actually, in this sense, both as a tool for society, but also a reflection of society. So it's not schools that determine that delivering parcels isn't a dignified job, or it doesn't get the respect that it deserves. It's not us that determines that, but nonetheless, we reflect a wider social movement and therefore shape how we define potential and how we define success around that too. And so I suppose where I would come from it on this is that, and Catherine mentioned this earlier, that once they leave our gates, it's for them to decide what the good life looks like. I would also just make sure that we ourselves as schools rehabilitate the idea that it doesn't just have to look like going to university, or it doesn't just have to look like gaining credentials in a particular area. I think the second thing I would also add is what does fulfilling that potential look like? I mean, I think it's possibly, maybe it's just a reality of the fact that we're all judged by league tables and results, that we define potential as academic achievement, or the fulfillment of potential around academic achievement primarily. And there's always like a small source of sadness that somebody has not achieved their potential if they don't get to a certain level with their academic outcomes. And I suppose I would just push back against that a little bit as well, especially when we then punish them later down the line and say that they can't do certain other things because they didn't hit those grades, and I suppose for me it would be a case of saying that the potential in that one narrow strata of measurement isn't the whole story here. And I would personally want schools to recognise the other forms of potential that also deserve to be achieved within a school system. I often think this about league tables. There's a big back and forth. Should we have league tables? Are they destructive? And I tend to think, well, I don't think league tables are inherently problematic, although the current form are. But wouldn't it be interesting if we measured other things too? Like, wouldn't it be great if we were able to say just how many of our children have had access to playing an instrument? How many of our children have been able to be in a performance? How many of our children have been able to go and do these kind of off-map things that actually are not straightforwardly measured in the same way as the traditional academic curriculum? Because I would argue that's a fulfillment of potential that we have a responsibility for as well.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, we've got so many questions coming in, and we're not going to have time to get through them all because we've only got half an hour left. So I'm going to, two of the questions are the same. I'm going to put them towards Dominic, which is around secularism. We've got, I think, about a third of UK schools are faith schools, but at the same time, there is a sort of rising tide of secularism in this country. Can secularism be reconciled with the virtues that you were talking about in your piece, or does it need some transcendent or Christian overarching vision in which to kind of make good on the sorts of values and virtues that have been discussed so far?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I sound a bit strange, I think, saying that you know, as the world steams ahead and we get into the you know, the full 21st century package, that you need schools which have the freedom to set their own values. Now, there's a sort of negative reason for this, and then there's a positive reason. So the negative reason is that while in these sorts of settings, we could talk about a woke agenda. In fact, that woke agenda, woke culture is not actually coherent. So it doesn't produce the sort of narrative and sense of belonging that is internally consistent. So you are not going to have social justice schools that have permanent agreement about what is required by social justice. I mean, this is why we have politics as a realm of debate. You know, in a democracy, we sort of have the legislative chamber as a specialist institution for listening to views and to forming some sort of majority consensus if possible. And you can't have schools playing that function. For that matter, you can't have universities playing that function. I mean, I work in Oxford University, and it's just amazing that on the one hand, you have a group of dedicated scientists developing the vaccine, which is hopefully going to, you know, support the world through this crisis. And on the other hand, you've got a group which has mainly been focused on pulling down the statue of Cecil Rhodes. The latter group, pulling something down doesn't give you coherence in building something up. And so it's not the case that even if you agree with everything that's currently sort of what we'd understand as woke agenda, that is not going to provide you a permanent set of beliefs for the generations to come. But the more positive reason is that in your life, in my life, that there's going to be a few people who you can say took you seriously, took your values seriously, and talked with you about them. Unfortunately, it may be some people never really have someone who took them that seriously. What Catherine is doing in her school means that a child is taken seriously every day, and that is very, very unique. And you know, I'm just in admiration of that. For my life, I could say there are sort of 3 or 4 people who really took my values seriously, and that helped me develop a sense of purpose. Now, if you don't have that in the school, then you are not going to build people up with this dignity, sense of respect, and sense of honor. But you can't have that serious, taking children seriously, unless teachers and school founders can have a debate over the common values that they have.
Thanks, Dominic. That actually leads to our first question from the floor from Andrew Lewis, MBE and MP. Mike, do you want to give the microphone to Andrew?
Yes, I think Andrew is now on.
Over to you, Andrew.
You just need to unmute yourself, Andrew, sorry.
There we go. Okay. Couldn't have a meeting without that happening, could we? Does the panel believe that the woke agenda has reached its high watermark now, or do they believe it will continue to be the prevailing orthodoxy in the country's public life?
Thanks, Andrew. And I think I'll go to Catherine, but rather than go to the whole panel, just so we can get through questions. So I'll go to one speaker at each. Catherine, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. They're not finished. we're in big trouble. If we go down the route of America, which I suspect we will, because we kind of do in everything, then you know, things are going to get much worse. You know, in America, in schools there, you know, in every subject, their identity politics reigns. There is so much pressure on teachers to stop teaching traditional content. I always feel really happy whenever I read anything about what's going on in America or talk to teachers there, actually, because I think, thank goodness, we're in Britain and it's not like that here. But you can see it becoming increasingly that way. And sadly, I think there are too many, well, white middle class teachers in teaching who feel very guilty about their whiteness. And so they are sadly kind of taken in by the woke agenda of pushing identity politics, is what I would say. And how we address that, I don't know, because, well, it's very difficult to address. There we go.
Thanks, Catherine.
Sorry, Will, can I
Yes,
just throw
Michael,
something in there? Sorry, I won't, just very, very quickly. I would also just stress that there is geographic disparity here too. I don't know, maybe we're 20 years behind London with lots of things, and maybe it is with this too, but I've got to say that on the ground, there's lots of places that just don't have the same problems that inner cities might have with regard to some of these contested ideas. And so sometimes this debate can just seem a little bit distant, and things are offered as a truth, which in many places just kind of might not be, that might be absent.
Interesting. And possibly a consequence of Catherine's very public profile, that she receives much more attention on these questions that other parts of the country might not. Okay, I'm going to go to Harry Horton now, who's got a question which picks up our last comment from Dominic about the ends of liberalism, which I think he wanted to ask to both John and to Catherine. Harry, over to you.
And you're on mute, Harry.
Hi there. Yeah, and thanks for such an interesting discussion so far. My question sort of is about difference in opinion, perhaps, between John and Catherine. John seemed to be kind of arguing for a more substantive conception of the good, whereas Catherine perhaps wanted more neutral and allow students to make decisions later on, despite the sort of school having more kind of active policies around, you know, kind of curriculum, flag discipline, etc. And one of the classic criticisms of liberalism is that it can't, in practice, remain neutral between these different conceptions of the good. And does that therefore mean that a kind of post-liberal education necessarily has a kind of more fulsome, substantive conception of the good and what we want children to become, what values we want them to have, and is what is now needed, and yeah, do we need to kind of confidently argue for and put that forward, that conception, or do we leave it to schools to kind of make decisions themselves about what they want to be about?
John, do you want to jump off on that one, and then if needed, Catherine can come back?
Yes, I mean, I think that we can only oppose the wake agenda if we do engage with this question of the substantive good. So that the question is the alternative between a false concern with morality and a true one. You know, if we're not engaged with the question of what the good life is, what true human flourishing is, what we share in common is, then inevitably everything collapses in favor of the rights of individuals and the rights of identities. And then ultimately that also undercuts your program of the pursuit of truth, because instead of the pursuit of truth, everything becomes about affirming this kind of identity politics and reducing history to the history of the emancipation of identities and so on. So that if you don't engage properly this question of the ethical, you get this false kind of moralization. So that when I say that you should link knowledge to the good, I'm talking, of course, about an ethics of virtue approach. You know, instead of certain kind of shibboleths, you're thinking all the time about how the pursuit of certain tasks or the pursuit of truth is related to the ends of human flourishing, the idea that the good and the true are inseparable, and that ethics is about the development of your entire life. So that I think unless we radically engage with this, we will be totally unable to resist the woke agenda, because despite what old-fashioned liberals say, actually wokeness is logical in terms of liberalism. Now, this doesn't mean that we're going to sort of impose our ideas of the good. Traditions, the classical and biblical traditions about trying to identify the good are about dialectical debate to a large extent. It's also always a question of what is the good and trying to work out what the good is. But unless we have that process of discernment, then what takes its place? What takes its place is merely the pursuit of power and something anarchic. So I very much agree with the idea that we need different schools around different understandings of what value is. And that the important thing is that teachers be honest, that they not hide their views, but they propose certain coherent visions that are then open to debate, and children may receive or not. But it's this rejection of the question of, what is the good life? What is human existence for? What is going to complete us in the end? If we negate that, then we hand everything over to either economic functionalism on the one hand, or the woke cultural agenda on the other, or more likely a fusion of the two.
Thank you, John. It reminds me of what Roger Scruton said, that the task in a society that debunks a lot of myths and truths is to learn how to bunk them again and to put belief back into knowledge and material for students.
That's right.
So that they
he was
can...
right. Yeah.
Catherine, is there anything that you disagree with in that? I suppose.
No, I
yeah.
think that I don't think we disagree, John and I.
Yeah.
No, I don't think so.
I think the distinction, or not the distinction, but what I was saying was, what kinds of careers they might have, what they might want to do with their lives. That's up to them. But we definitely teach them right from wrong and to have a sense of pursuing truth, which I would say perhaps doesn't exist so much elsewhere.
Maybe including the question of what kind of careers do we want there to be? What are authentic human roles? So many people go into really non-jobs nowadays, just sending emails to each other all the time. Am
I right, Catherine, that your first group of students are about to leave the school at the end of sixth form?
Well, and of course we had a number of them who left. So yes, you're right. Our first cohort is about to leave year 13, but only some of them stayed for the sixth form. Many of them went off at GCSE to a variety of different other colleges and so on. And this is where, in terms of Michael, what he was saying, there's a couple of girls who've gone off to big hairdressers and they followed that route, and that's great. And where Michael is right is that sometimes in schools there's too much of this push towards you must go to university. Your life is worthless unless you get to university. And that's wrong. Having said that, I think the reason why schools end up there is because too often some children can be failed and they're not able to fulfill their potential. And when I say fulfill their potential, be able to achieve as much academically as they can, and I think that's a good thing, them achieving academically,
Of course, yeah.
Michael, I saw you unmuted.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think another reason that schools end up there is because everybody who works in the building has gone through that pathway. All the teachers and things like that, and so that creates that kind of expectation, that kind of understanding of what the best route is, and creates that kind of cultural division between a graduate, generally liberal, graduate educated teaching body and to use David Goodhart's terms, kind of more anywhere populace in front of us. And I think it's reasonable to have that discussion about what's the right relationship between those two things, because it clearly needs a little bit of both, doesn't it?
Catherine, could it be fair to say that that there may be some jobs or positions that your alumni end up at, that they would be sort of conscious that they would have won your pride or respect, or the opposite, that if they did something in particular, they would think that the school and the teachers and maybe some of their peers would actually look down on them in some way.
Yeah, so poor behavior would
Right.
get looking down on them.
You're against that.
You know,
We get it. Yeah.
But I mean, in their later life,
being mean to each other, you know, not helping each other out. When somebody drops a plate in our dining hall, you know, in some schools, when they drop a plate in the dining hall, all the children start going, "Wah!" That's what they do, right? In our school, when a plate drops, 5 or 6 other children rush to help to pick it up and help the child who's in the embarrassing situation that they're in. Whereas elsewhere, perhaps, when you're doing this, the idea is we're increasing the humiliation for that child. And we're sort of laughing at them. And that sort of thing just doesn't happen here. The children don't turn on each other in that kind of fashion.
Thanks.
Amazing.
Okay, I'm going to go to Tim next to ask a question about sort of national pride and sort of the education of citizens and looking at an international perspective as well. Tim Emmett. Welcome, Tim.
Tim, if you can unmute yourself, please.
Put this question to Michael or Dominic.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, and you can
yes.
see me. Thank you. Well, education is obviously an instrument of social control in most places, and in countries which I'm familiar with, it very much is around producing the right citizens for that country. And you can look at France, you can look at Russia, China, Japan, many places want to have a very clear imprimatur on citizenship and what it actually means. And I was reading the other day that up in Scotland, the view is that the SQA is now influencing the curriculum in Scottish schools to such an extent that it is helping to foster the requirement for independence from the rest of the UK. And I just wondered what you thought about this whole business of education for citizenship being a very, very, tightly controlled and requirement in many countries. In Japan, for example, all the textbooks have to be ordained and approved by the Ministry of Education, and therefore lots of things get omitted and lots of things are included. And of course, here in this country, there's a big push now to rewrite history along the so-called woke agenda.
Thank you, Tim. Michael, you're very close to Scotland. Do you want to jump in?
Not into Scotland directly, no. Gosh, weather's worse up there than it is here. So yeah, a couple of points about that. I mean, that's a common argument, wasn't it, when education was first nationalised? You know, this was one thing that was identified as a potential downfall, that it could be used as a means of social control. I suppose, I mean, like all things, if things are used badly, then they would lead to bad things. But then the same thing could be used in a good way too. I think what I'd say is two things. Firstly, that when we have and I do understand your concern, particularly around curriculum issues, and obviously curriculum's become a good thing, big thing, and people wish to use that as a means to shape people's approach, to life and understanding themselves and understanding society. So it's not a irrelevant question. I suppose I would only say two things. Firstly, that also gives opportunity. So for us in our school, our two key founding values, the two key things that shapes everything, is Genesis 1:27. We're Catholic school. Genesis 1:27, that everyone's created in the image of God, and Matthew 25:40, that which you do to the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you do unto me. Now, it seems to me that's a good thing. It's a good thing that the 10% of our schools have that as foundational values, because it means rather a lot of children are going to go into society and hopefully take that positive message, that I would say virtuous way of looking at the world with them. Not always successfully, but it's a great opportunity. So I suppose that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is that schools don't have a monopoly on learning. Schools are here to support parents in the education of their child. They're not there to be the only source of education for their child. And so where what we do is contested, and it will be, and when John's talking about having different schools with different values and different cultures, I would add that that will be constrained by geography. And so you will still get some parents who are having to go to a school that they might not fully agree with that. But I suppose what I would say is that it's not only in school where they're going to learn things. And so whereas we would have our vision of curriculum and our idea of what needs to be passed on, and that should always be able to be shaped and contested and allow a little bit of local variation. I would just say that that's not the end of the story, really. That's the start of it. We're preparing them for inhabiting a future life. We're not, we're not erecting walls around what they're allowed to know.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, I'm going to go to Sapna now, who's got two questions. I'll leave it up to you, Sapna, as to which one you want to ask.
Bear with me one moment, Will, and I'm going to bring Sapna on. I think Sapna is not long.
Okay.
Will, could I quickly just jump in for a second on this citizenship point?
Yes, of course, Dominic. Yeah, that'd be great. If
Sorry, I just wanted to add to the wonderful comments of Michael. So my wife, Rothio, she's just finished her teacher training in Swan Academy in Oxford, which takes on a lot of the ideals of what sort of Catherine has been pushing for in Michaela. And there is this sense sometimes, I think, a fear that with a kind of regimentation of the school life, that it can somehow be socially controlling. And Philip Blond mentioned that, part of, his motivation for these questions is an understanding of liberty before liberalism. So we don't want sort of the liberal woke agenda. We're going to a kind of post-liberalism saying of education, and in that sense, we don't throw away the kind of understandings of liberty which are essential to our citizenship. And I think just part of it, it may help, but it may not. But the part of navigating this is just to distinguish between unity and uniformity. So in schools, my understanding, like Swan Academy and others, the aim isn't uniformity, but it is a certain unity which people are struggling to feel a sense of belonging and trust, bonds with one another. So when people come together to help the plate, it's not because of fear of the dictator that we have to not slap on the tables and instead help the student, but it's because of a sort of a genuine unity. And I think we have to reflect more on what is our citizenship in terms of our civic ideals, and then help realize that through the schools, rather than taking off the shelf a sort of sense of citizenship is about uniformity.
Thanks, Dominic. Well, look, we've got just over 5 minutes left, and I think it would be good. Oh, Catherine, do you want to show us a picture?
This is
Great.
a really good example of how things work. But this tells you how it works for all children, but this is what we use here. So it's true that in the dining hall, when the plate is dropped, there will be a few children who don't bang the table because they're at the bottom of the pyramid. We talk about climbing to the top of the pyramid. You want to be a top of the pyramid person. And they're at the bottom and they don't bang the table because they don't want to get in trouble, right? There are a few. But then what you do with the child is that you're molding them over time so that eventually they get to a point where actually they want to get a bit of praise. So that's why they do the right thing. And then they want to impress somebody. They want to impress their teachers, or because they get the idea of having a great future. And the point at the top is it's who we are. You want to move children from not wanting to get into trouble to eventually doing the right thing, because that's just who they are. Now, if you don't understand that children are growing up and they're moving up a pyramid all the time with every characteristic. So whether that's being able to sit up straight, bringing in a pen, being kind to your friends, whatever it is, you want to encourage children and scaffold them up that pyramid so eventually they're just doing it because that's who they are. to assume that children are experts at all of this and that they can do it just because it's who they are is absurd. I mean, they're children. You would never expect a 4-year-old to be able to cross the street. You do it gradually. You hold their hand, you take them to the street. You do it over and over for years, until eventually you might allow your child to cross the street on their own. It's the same with every skill. And so when I talk about that bag of goodies, by the time they leave us, the idea is for them to be at the top of the pyramid for all of those skills. Yeah?
Thanks, Catherine.
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to go to Philip to ask a final question. And can I just, just my final comment to just say a huge thanks and gratitude to the 4 panelists and for all of you for attending for what has been a really thought-provoking and even richer discussion than I was looking forward to. So thank you very much from me. Philip, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. It's really been fascinating. Look, I think it's really interesting that Catherine took us to, at the end, it's who we are. And I think Catherine then, touched on the absolute difference between a liberal education and a post-liberal education. Ultimately, metaphysically, liberalism has no content. It denies questions of ultimate value, and it says they don't exist. If it did, we wouldn't know them. And of course, since ultimate values don't exist, we can't share them. So all there is in liberalism is empty assertion. It's nihilistic at base. But what I think both Catherine and John and everyone else have been speaking about is that isn't true. Ultimately, a post-liberal school is dedicated to a system of values. Now, as John rightly says, and the tradition has always been like this, if you go to Plato and Platonic dialogues, they're not assertions, they're arguments that outline different positions within the discernment of the good. And the ultimate difference of a post-liberal school is you are dedicated to the discernment of the good. And that is an open, plural, and liberal agenda. Would the panel agree?
Should we go in the order that we started with? Just 1 minute from each of you. John, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, I would totally agree. It's a debate about the discernment of the good and about the true, and about the links between those two things. And I think that is about training in citizenship in the broad sense, because I think we've got to distinguish that from just being trained to be some kind of instrumental functionary. A citizen is somebody who actively engages in the government of their society, actively engages in shaping its values and its discernment, such that politics itself remains a political process. Now, I think in the case of, somewhere like France and maybe Japan, you've got too narrowly a statist sense of what that citizenship is. But there's something still quite kind of admirable about that Republican opposed to more liberal approach. And I think what we need really in this country, but elsewhere as well, is a kind of less statist version of that, a sense that citizenship is about engagement in the whole range of civil society, not just the political narrowly defined. And then you get a sense that being a citizen continues to be more of a kind of open, ongoing debate. Rather than reducing citizenship to some kind of state function.
Thank you, John. Catherine, on to you. Just for
Yes. So,
closing remark.
Yeah, citizenship. I mean, we're talking about moving on from citizenship on that idea. I don't understand why we reject the idea of being a citizen of Britain, and that there ought to be a certain understanding what that looks like. Every other country has it, like France and Japan and so on. And it's a bit odd when the football is on in the World Cup and you're in a pub and you're asking, what football team do you support? when you're in Colombia and everyone's watching football, nobody's asking, what football team do you support? It's clear you support Colombia. So there's something a bit odd about Britain. And we at Michaela certainly stand against that, because you know, our children, their parents and grandparents and so on might come from all over the place, but you know, we are British and we're British together, and I think that's a wonderful thing.
And I also feel that it's incredibly racist to suggest that, you know, people who've come from elsewhere, the Caribbean or Africa, can't fully embrace, you know, the British and the European story. And in most cases, they're already within that story. It's absolutely appalling to suggest that they're simply confined to narrow trajectories.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Michael.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question, Philip. It reminds me of a hymn that I was taught as a kid and that our kids still sing today. And the refrain is, some of you might recognize it: God is good, God is truth, God is beauty, praise him. And I think that's at the heart of how we see the world around us, and how we see our obligation to our children to give them the opportunity to experience that. I suppose that there's 2 points I would make, though. Firstly, we have a little bit of coverage for doing that. We're based within the faith sector that has never fully given up on the idea of a universal truth. I mean, there's been moments, haven't there? But nonetheless, we've never fully given up on it. And so therefore, it's possibly we have a little bit of ability to not be as kind of harassed on those points as some others might be. I suppose the interesting question I have, I remember doing a debate a couple of years ago down in London with various folks who describe themselves as humanists and you know, things like this. And the claim was made that most schools now are humanist schools anyway, particularly community schools. And I think about some of the aggro that Catherine's had over the years. And I suppose the interesting question for me politically is, are community schools in the same position to be able to take that position on questions of truth and value, on beauty and goodness as well? Or are they more contested arenas by nature?
Dominic, to round us off, lead us out.
Yeah, just a very minor addition to this, that the internet does provide so many alternatives to traditional education and what we understand as the world of information. So in this common pursuit of the good in a school, I do think you have to add to all of these discussions the need for specialist classes on how to best navigate the internet, make use of the internet. I think it is appropriate within civics to have a proper discussion of fake news and how to avoid fake news, and also the sorts of anxieties that are brought about in social media. And in this sense, everything we do in this pursuit of the good in schools requires a training of best use of the internet, or a lot of it falls away. So that would be my sort of challenge to schools right now, of how do you develop a curriculum for navigating morally the internet.
Thank you, Dominic. Philip, any last remarks just on what's left for the rest of the year for Res Publica and other events that might be on the horizon?
Certainly. Thanks again. Well, we're going to continue the post-liberalism theme. The next one I've got planned is, you know, the post-liberal Anglican Church, since Anglicanism is poised at the edge of committing suicide in public. There are nonetheless very good priests still, and people who rightly want to save the church. So we'll be studying that. We're also going to have a seminar on post-liberalism after Trump with our American friends, on post-liberalism in Central Europe. So we're going to keep continuing the intellectual path and the policy path, because that's what we need now. So very grateful and look forward to studying this more. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Farewell.
Thanks, Will.
See you all soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.